The Civil War was the single most important event in United States history. At the start of the war, Minnesota was the first state to volunteer troops in support of the Union, and over the course of the next 4 years, more than 22,000 Minnesotans, serving in 23 different military organizations, helped to shape our nation's history. At a time of deep division in our country, Abraham Lincoln took office as President of the United States in March of 1861. Disagreement over issues including states' rights and slavery were so strong that by April, 7 states had broken away from the Union, formed a provisional government, written a constitution, and elected Jefferson Davis as President of the Confederate States of America. As tensions rose, troops from the Confederacy blockaded Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, and on April 12th fired on the fort. The federal garrison soon surrendered. At the time of the attack, Minnesota had been a state for only 3 years and had a population of just 150,000. Minnesota Governor Alexander Ramsey was in Washington, D.C. at the time of the Fort Sumter attack, and on April 13th offered 1,000 volunteers to defend the Union, making Minnesota the first state to volunteer soldiers to the Union Army. 2 days later, President Lincoln proclaimed a state of insurrection and called for 75,000 volunteers. Soon another 4 states joined the Confederacy, and what would become a long and bloody Civil War began, a war that would eventually bring freedom to 4 million slaves and lead to a stronger central government in the United States. But the larger story of the Civil War is shaped by thousands of smaller stories, stories of people whose lives were changed forever by the war that began that day in April of 1861. In Minnesota, many of the stories began with news of the need for volunteers. On the fringe of the frontier, and with the highest percentage of young men in any state, Minnesota soon filled its 1st Infantry Regiment. Among the first to volunteer was a 28-year-old miller from Anoka. Aaron Greenwald, a husband and father of 2 young sons, joined Company C of the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment on April 29th. Also on April 29th, 6-foot-tall, 23-year-old John Merritt from Winona joined Company K. In May, 19-year-old Charles Baker left work on a farm in Rosemont, said goodbye to his wife Louisa, and joined Company D. After training at Fort Snelling, members of the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Regiment were sent east to join the Union Army. The men of the 1st Minnesota had been east for only a month when federal forces marched 26 miles from Washington to Manassas Junction, Virginia, where Confederate forces were concentrated. In a bloody, all-day battle known as Bull Run, Union troops were routed, and the 1st Minnesota suffered more casualties than any other federal regiment. During the battle, John Merritt and 4 comrades spotted a Confederate flag waving in the smoke. They ran forward, confronted the flag-bearer, and captured the flag. But as they ran back toward federal lines, all were shot down and the flag recaptured. Merritt was wounded but managed to escape, and once recovered returned to serve again with his regiment. By September, the 1st and 2nd Minnesota Infantry Regiments were already in the field when an appeal came for 2 more. John Sanborn, Minnesota Adjutant General, headed recruiting efforts. And by fall, the 3rd and 4th Minnesota were raised. The 3rd was sent to fight, and the 4th kept home to protect the frontier. The 5th was being recruited. After filling 3 regiments in December of 1861, Sanborn became colonel of the 4th Minnesota, and later in the war became a brigade commander and general. Among the new volunteers was Thomas Dwell, a farmer from Lake City. On September 10th, shortly after his 21st birthday, he joined Company I of the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry. In October, Dwell was shot during a skirmish known as Edwards Ferry and was sent home to recover, but returned to his unit in February of 1862. During 1862, Minnesota troops were involved in important battles at Mill Spring, Corinth, and in the Peninsular Campaign. And in July, the 1st Minnesota Infantry and 2nd Minnesota Sharpshooters suffered over 150 casualties at Antietam in Maryland. Thomas Dwell was among the Minnesotans to survive the battle at Antietam. Of that bloody day, he wrote in his diary, "Our loss was very heavy." Dwell kept his diary until February of 1863, when he was discharged for disability related to the wounds he had received at Edwards Ferry. He returned to Lake City and resumed farming. In 1863, Minnesota troops were involved in battles at Vicksburg, Murfreesboro, and Missionary Ridge. And in July, Union and Confederate armies met at the crossroads town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The 1st Minnesota arrived in Gettysburg on July 1st. The next evening, they were thrown into a gap in Union lines to attack a force at least 5 times their number. Of the 262 men who charged, only 47 were alive and unwounded 15 minutes later. The highest percentage of casualties of any Union regiment in any single fight of the war, the 1st Minnesota charge at Gettysburg became a legend. Among those killed was young Private Charles Baker. During the legendary charge, Company C of the 1st Minnesota was away from the battlefield on guard duty, but on July 3rd was brought in to shore up the remnants of the regiment. During a battle to repulse Confederate General Pickett's charge, Company C's Sergeant Aaron Greenwald was mortally wounded and was found on the battlefield the next day. On July 5th, Aaron died of his wounds, leaving behind his widow Anna and 2 young sons. In 1864, Minnesotans continued to fight for the Union cause. After capturing the important rail and manufacturing center at Atlanta in September, Union General William Sherman's forces, including the 2nd and 4th Minnesota Regiments of Infantry and the 1st Battery of Minnesota Light Artillery, marched over 300 miles to Savannah on the coast. Now known as Sherman's March to the Sea, along the way they confiscated supplies and destroyed crops, mills, and small factories. In December, 4 Minnesota regiments participated in the Battle of Nashville. And as the war raged on, Minnesotans continued to volunteer for service. In October, teenager Albert Wilson joined Company C of the 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery and served as a drummer and bugler while on garrison and guard duty in Tennessee. Wilson was the son of a Union soldier who died of wounds received at the 1862 Battle of Shiloh. The war continued into the spring of 1865. In April, the 1st Battalion Minnesota Volunteer Infantry was present at a battle at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. And on April 9th, at Appomattox, Confederate General Lee surrendered to Union General Grant. Over the next few weeks, Confederate armies from North Carolina to Texas disbanded, and Union victory was declared. On April 13, 1865, nearly 4 years after declaring the state of insurrection and calling for troops to defend the Union, President Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He died the next day. In May, federal armies marched to Washington to stage a 2-day grand review before new President Johnson. Among them were veteran Minnesota units. Soon troops began returning home to Minnesota. During the course of the war, over 600 Minnesotans died in action, and over 3 times that many died of disease and accident. Several Minnesotans were later awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for their service, including John Merritt, who was awarded the medal for his actions at Bull Run. In 1864, Merritt left the Army after 3 years of service. In 1867, moved his family to Washington to serve as Sergeant at Arms in the U.S. Senate. He died in 1892 and is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Merritt's Medal of Honor was awarded to him in 1880 by the United States Secretary of War and former Governor of Minnesota, Alexander Ramsey. Ramsey had also served as the first president of the Minnesota Historical Society. He died in 1903. After leaving military service, John Sanborn remained active in veterans organizations and state politics. He served as a state representative and senator, and in 1903 was elected president of the Minnesota Historical Society. He died in 1904. Albert Wilson was discharged in September of 1865 and lived in Mankato and St. Peter before moving to Duluth. Wilson became an active member of the Grand Army of the Republic, a Civil War veterans organization. In 1956, Wilson, the last surviving Civil War soldier, died in Duluth at the age of 109. The Grand Army of the Republic was disbanded shortly after his death. These are just some of the stories of the Minnesotans who helped to shape our nation's history. To honor the memory of all who served and to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, the Minnesota Military Museum invites you to visit a special exhibit, Minnesota and the Civil War. The exhibit artifacts include Charles Baker's soldier stencil, found at a first Minnesota campsite over a century after the war, and the pocket diary in which Thomas Dwell recorded his thoughts on the Battle of Antietam, plus a flag remnant from the Battle of Gettysburg, personal items from soldiers, and stories, more stories of the many Minnesotans who helped shape our nation's history. The exhibit is on display through 2015. Please visit the museum website for more information.